Okay guys, today I'm going to have you take paper notes. There's a reason for taking paper notes, and that is that when you physically write something, it helps that something stay in your head a little bit better. So whenever I take notes, I don't do it digitally. I do it on paper because I know that if I write something out that I'll remember it better. I'm going to do Cornell notes. I'm going to start by titling my notes Context Clues. So my notes are called Context Clues. And when we take Cornell notes, we include an essential question. An essential question can be abbreviated as an EQ. So our EQ this time is, how do I figure out the meaning of an unknown word I find while reading? So the EQ helps me keep track and keep focused on what the point of my notes is. Today's notes are focused on these things called context clues, and I'm going to be using my essential question to guide me in my understanding. How do I figure out the meaning of an unknown word I find while reading? So I'm going to see if I can answer that question by the time I'm done with my notes. So over here, I have my question column, or my Q column. This side will be my notes column, where I actually take my notes. So in the question column, you're coming up with questions that you think I might ask on a quiz or something. It's also where you would put vocabulary. The notes column is where you're actually going to take your notes. So we're going to go ahead and start taking our notes on context clues. So use context clues to help you figure out unknown words. So say you come upon something in a text, you don't know that word, you can use the tricks that we're going to talk about right now to help you come up with an idea of what that word might mean. But first we need to understand that word context. So that would be a vocabulary word, and you could put that here in your Q column. Context. Context is the words or pictures around a word that you can pull clues from. So basically it's when you're reading a text, and you come up across that word, you're going to look at the stuff around it to figure out what it means. So think about like context. If you see a guy with a hose, you have to look at the stuff around him to figure out what the point of that hose is or what that guy is doing, right? If you see that he's outside in the backyard and there's a swimming pool, he's probably filling up the swimming pool with the hose. He might be a caretaker for that pool, right? So that the stuff around him helps you understand what that hose is for in that moment. If he's using that hose to put out a fire, you can use that context to guess that he's probably a firefighter, right? Or if he's outside watering the plants, you could use that context to help you understand that he's using the hose as a gardener, right? So the stuff around him helps us understand what he is and what he's doing. Same kind of thing for these unknown words. We're going to look at the stuff around the word to help us get an idea of what that word means. So, we're going to use an acronym, which is just a tool to help us remember, to remember the different kinds of context clues we can find. So, our acronym is the word ideas. The I in ideas is for inference. So if you remember from the race hyperdoc, we talked a little bit about inferences. Inferences are when you have clues from the text and your life experience that you use to make a guess about something. So use text clues and life experience to figure out a meaning. And notice that in my notes I used a little abbreviation, right? Since I like to play video games, I know that XP stands for experience points, right? So I use it in my notes to represent the word experience. Here's an example. Let's use this sentence. You don't want to work with Ricky. Unless you want to hear him talk about himself. He's so arrogant. So I can use the context around there to help me understand what arrogant means, right? I can use my life experience of the kinds of people I wouldn't want to work with and what people are like when they talk about themselves that much to understand that arrogant probably means something to do with a person who thinks a lot of themselves, right? Okay, so the next part of ideas is the D. And the D stands for definition. So sometimes we get lucky and the author or the writer will give us the definition of the word right there in the text. Sometimes they'll do it where they have the word and then they'll put after the word in between commas the definition. So this is the meaning of the word is given in the sentence. So here's an example of that one. Ricky is so arrogant. He thinks he's more important than anyone else. Okay, so the author of that sentence included the idea that he thinks he's really a very important person, right? They gave us a definition for that word right after they gave it to us. So notice that sometimes context clues can happen before the word, like in our first example, or sometimes it can happen after, like in this second example here. When you take your context clues lesson on iReady, you'll see that they mention those ones where they have it in a positive. So remember that in a positive, oops, let me change the color of that. And a positive is just a definition context clue that's given in between commas. All right, so we've got our I, we've got our D. The next letter in ideas is E. The E stands for example. Sometimes the author's good enough to give us an example of someone who's being whatever the word is that we're not sure of. So they show us something that's an example of the word. And here's an example of the example context clue. Ricky's so arrogant. He's always bragging about how great he is at sports. So I see that an example of him being arrogant here is that he's bragging about how great he is, right? Arrogant people brag about themselves. That helps me have a better understanding of what arrogant means. All right, so I have my I, my D, my E. The next letter for ideas is going to be my A. So the A in ideas stands for antonym. It might have been a little while since you have talked about antonyms, but antonyms are those words that have opposite meanings. So light and dark, fat and skinny, those kinds of words are opposites. Antonyms are opposites. So sometimes we'll get an antonym context clue in our reading. And this is just, like I said, a word with an opposite meaning used as a contrast. So it's showing a difference. Okay, so antonym clues are used to show a difference. And here's an example of that using poor Ricky again. Ricky's so arrogant. He needs to be humble. Like his brother Jose. So we can tell that Jose and Ricky are opposites of each other, right? And humble, you might have more experience with than with arrogant. A humble person is somebody who doesn't go out and brags about himself. A humble person just quietly does those things that they're good at, and they don't feel like they need to talk about it. So if Ricky is the opposite of that, then he's somebody who feels like he needs to talk about himself a lot, and he's probably bragging about how good he is at things, right? So we have opposites there. Sometimes you will also see, like in Study Sync, you'll see that they expand this idea of antonyms into, they call it contrast clues. So I'm going to put down here AKA contrast clues. It's the same thing. You're looking at the differences between two words or between examples, and that helps give you a better understanding of what that initial word was. Okay, and now the last part of ideas is the S. The S stands for synonyms. Synonyms are words that mean the same or close to the same thing. So it's a word with a similar meaning being used. Okay, so here's our example with Ricky again. Ricky is so arrogant, proud, and overbearing. They gave us a whole list of words that basically means the exact same thing. So an arrogant person is a proud person. They can be a little overbearing. That means they might be a little too much for other people to handle. So we're using words that are similar in meaning to understand what arrogant means. And sometimes you will see this used or described as a comparison clue. All right, so couple more things here. Sometimes our nonfiction texts use technical language from a particular field. Remember, nonfiction text is informational text. And it's best if, when you're looking at those ones, that you look for definitions and examples in those texts. So think of like a history textbook or a science textbook. Usually they will provide the definition for the word or an example of the word right there in the text so that you can understand what it means. So here is an example of that. The archaeologists discovered an important artifact. So maybe you didn't know what the word archaeologist meant, right? But you do know what an artifact is, that it's an old, it's basically something that humanity has created from a time in history. So an archaeologist would be somebody who's probably studying old stuff, right? And then here's another one, because sports can be technical too. Steph Curry shot a three-pointer from the top of the key. Maybe you don't know what the key is, right? But you do know that a three-pointer is a shot that somebody takes from a distance. So you can assume that the top of the key is not particularly close to the basket. And here's one last thing for you guys to keep in mind. Sometimes you won't be able to find a good context clue. It happens. And you know what? That's okay. When that happens, you can just use a reference tool like the dictionary, or a thesaurus. And here's my favorite one for you guys. If you really truly can't figure out a word and you need to understand it to understand what you're reading, I love Learner's Dictionary.com. It has really simple to understand definitions, so it's great for students. Okay, so you've taken your notes now, and you should now go back and work on creating questions that you have or you think I would ask on a quiz. So for example, if I go back to my page where I've got my inference stuff on it, I could put in the column over here the question, how can you make an inference as a context clue? So in my question column, I put this question right here, how can you make an inference as a context clue? That way I can quiz myself with these notes later on to make sure that I really understood the material. And then I would just go through and I'd probably do something similar like that for each one. Maybe for definition, I have, what does a definition context clue look like? So I want you to go through and make more quiz questions in your question column about the material that you just took notes on. When you're done with those questions, you're going to go back to the bottom of your notes or the end of your notes, and you are going to summarize your learning. And I'm going to put a little note here that it should answer my essential question from the beginning of my notes. So just a reminder of what our EQ was. The EQ, or the essential question, was how do I figure out the meaning of an unknown word I find while reading? So I should be trying to answer that question when I start writing my summary. I am going to ask for you guys to create questions in your question column and to summarize your learning at the end of your notes. And once you've done that, I want you to go ahead and scan your notes or take a picture of your notes and turn it in the turn-in location on Google Classroom. Have a good day, guys.